I'm Nancy Cavey, National ERISA and Individual Disability Attorney. Welcome to Winning Isn't Easy. Before we get started, I've got to give you a legal disclaimer. The Florida Bar Association says I have to tell you that this isn't legal advice, but nothing will ever prevent me from giving you easy to understand information and an overview of the disability insurance world, the games that carriers play, and what you need to know to get the disability benefits you deserve. So off we go. Do you have ME/CFS syndrome? If so, today's podcast is for you. If not, I still think there are lessons that you can learn from this podcast. Today, I'm going to talk about 4 things. The first thing is going to be ME/CFS syndrome and the 8 common reasons why ME/CFS claims get denied. 2, evidence, examinations, and carrier reactions to ME/CFS syndrome, part 1. Evidence, examinations, carrier reactions to ME/CFS fatigue syndrome, part 2. And in conclusion, ME/CFS and its relationship to COVID-19 disability claims. We've got a lot to cover, but before we do that, we're going to take a quick break. Welcome back to Winning Isn't Easy. ME/CFS claims and their relationship to COVID-19 disability claims. Now, why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because COVID-19 and ME/CFS are different diseases, but the symptoms can overlap. And I find that insurance companies tend to treat claims made by sufferers of both diseases very similar. Now, many people who unfortunately have had COVID have gone on to develop long-term COVID-19 symptoms. They're called COVID long haulers. This name can trivialize the symptoms which need to be not only recognized and diagnosed, but properly treated. And I think this is much like what happened to those who were ultimately diagnosed with ME/CFS many years ago. Dr. Fauci has said that the long hauler syndrome is really real and it's quite extensive, much like in the early days of ME/CFS. The disease is real and it's quite extensive, but it took a long time for the medical community to recognize ME/CFS, and worse, it took disability carriers even longer to recognize ME/CFS as disabling. Now, what they always argue is that there isn't any specific diagnosis for the persistent symptoms of ME/CFS. And they do that in COVID cases. They'll say there's no specific diagnosis for the persistent symptoms of COVID-19. They never really got, for quite some time, the disabling symptoms of ME/CFS. And that's happening in COVID-19 cases. They don't get the disabling symptoms of COVID-19. And much like back in the early days of ME/CFS, and even continuing today, the disability carrier plays on the subjective nature of ME/CFS, and they're doing that in COVID-19 claims. So I think that if you have a COVID-19 claim, that you can look to how ME/CFS claims were handled for guidance. And I think that there are 4 issues. There are 4 issues, much like ME/CFS claims. So what I'm saying is also applicable to ME/CFS claims. Issue 1 is that the carriers like to deny or contest claims because of lack of objective diagnosis. Now, one of the leading medical specialists in ME/CFS told me recently that their practice expects to see an increase in misdiagnosed patients because physicians don't know how to deal with COVID-19 claims. They don't know how to diagnose the symptoms. They don't know how to develop treatment for these symptoms. And as a result, much like ME/CFS, there is generally not one physician who handles all these symptoms, nor is there a hard diagnosis for the symptoms. And as a result, unfortunately, I think it's going to be a long journey for some COVID long-haul survivors to deal with this particular problem, much like it was in the early days of ME/CFS. Issue number 2 is the subjective nature of the symptoms and the subjective medical condition limitation in a policy. Now, ME/CFS and COVID-19 symptoms and complaints can't always be objectively measured. There are some disability policies that have provisions called subjective medical condition limitations. They will limit the period of time in which you get benefits. The clause will generally say that if you have symptoms associated with body pain, fatigue, cognitive issues, that we're only going to pay benefits for 2 years. Now, that can be an issue, particularly, I think, if the symptoms are the manifestation of an objective medical condition like ME/CFS or COVID-19. Because I think that a poorly written subjective medical condition limitation opens the doors for an argument that benefits should be paid because those subjective symptoms are based or are the manifestation of an objective diagnosis. But there are also more broadly written subjective medical condition limitations that say, look, we're only going to pay 2 years of benefits for medical conditions characterized by pain, muscle joint pain, headaches, ME/CFS, COVID-19, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll actually name the disease in addition to the symptoms. That, of course, can be problematic, and that might, in fact, be a valid limitation. There are, again, reasons why you might want to have an FCE or a cardiac pulmonary function test to document the objective basis of symptoms and how they impact your ability to function. But that really is going to be a product, in my view, of the subjective medical condition clause, if there is one in your policy. Now, another issue, number 3, is the mental nervous condition limitation. There are also mental nervous condition limitations in policies that can limit the payment of benefits to 2 years if a psychiatric illness is the cause of the disability. There are policies that are broadly written, much like the subjective medical condition limitation, that says if your medical condition contributes ever so slightly to your disability, your benefits are limited to just 2 years. I call this the Monty Python wafer-thin limitation in mental nervous conditions. Now, unfortunately, it's common for COVID-19 and ME/CFS sufferers to have the cognitive issues, and carriers will misclassify those as psychiatric in nature on purpose to try to apply the mental nervous condition limitation. And then, of course, issue number 4 in both ME/CFS cases and COVID-19 cases are treatment issues. Policies require that you get recognized treatment and that you comply with that treatment program. There is generally no recognized treatment protocol to address COVID long-haul sufferers' problems, particularly since COVID-19 has multi-symptom impact. So you can have problems with your heart, your lungs, your vascular system, neurological system, you can have cognitive issues, and the lack of treatment protocol or one-stop doctor, if you will, to treat those problems can play into the hands of a disability carrier who's looking for a reason to deny a claim. So we need to understand that there's just a host of reasons that these claims are going to be potentially denied, both based on the subjective nature of the condition, the lack of objective findings, policy term limitations, and treatment issues. If you have any questions about your rights to long-term disability benefits as a result of ME/CF or COVID-19, this is an area where you really do need the assistance of an experienced disability attorney. I think that there are some lessons that can be learned from contested ME/CFS claims that apply to COVID-19 claims. The first is that unlike ME/CFS, it's hard to pretend or argue that you didn't have COVID-19. I think the other lesson is that research into the basis of ME/CFS could be the starting point to begin understanding what has happened in the case of COVID long haulers. But I will tell you again that the treatment, diagnosis, and handling of ME/CFS claims is going to be the model that disability carriers are using. In fact, I'm seeing it right now to deny these COVID-19 long-term, long-haul claims. So, and I think that the other point I want to make is that unlike ME/CFS, COVID-19 will cause pulmonary, gastroenterological, neurological, and vascular issues. And these cases, I think, are a bit more complex than an ME/CFS case. And I know that sounds amazing, But I think that disability carriers are going to want to see specialty evaluations, treatments, and opinions if you have pulmonary, gastroenterological, neurological, or vascular issues that are going to be addressed as part of a disability claim. Having handled many ME, CFS, and COVID-19 claims, I understand that these claims are complicated, and this is not an area where I think that you should be handling your claim by yourself. So I hope that you have learned not only information about ME, CFS, but that you've learned how the COVID-19 claims are going to be handled. I hope you have enjoyed this week's episode. If you like this podcast, consider liking our page, leaving a review, or sharing it with your friends or family. And remember, our podcast comes out weekly. So stay tuned for next week's episode of Winning Isn't Easy. Thanks.